This is 0verture, the Prelude Podcast. Welcome to the Prelude Podcast. My name is Kris and I'm a principal security researcher here at Prelude.
Hi, and I'm Alex Manners. I'm a principal security engineer at Prelude, and I do the security engineering lead function as well.
We wanted to start off the podcast by talking a little bit about how we want to structure our podcast going into 2022. This year, we want to focus less on Prelude as a company and the products that we have, and really dive deep into cybersecurity as a whole and everything that falls underneath that. So offensive, defensive security, training, career development, anything that has to do with the cybersecurity domain, we want to focus on that more than what we're focusing on in the company specifically.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of content that we can focus on in just InfoSec, career development, building small business, FOSS projects that we've worked on in the past, and occasional nerdy outside of all of those realm type things that we find interesting. But we also, because of the backgrounds of people in our company and the types of people we're trying to get onto this podcast as speakers and guests, I think that lets us shift our focus away from just Prelude as a company, and it makes this a more approachable, accessible type of podcast for people.
Yeah, and this allows us to kind of get into some more nitty-gritty topics and really dive in to some of the security topics that I know we want to cover this year. And then I think, too, a big part of what we wanted to accomplish this year is to invite more people to our podcast. And also getting more of the voice of Prelude, right? So like getting all of our staff to if they want to be on the podcast, to get them on the podcast and let's talk about security interests that interest them. So
I think one of our most popular podcasts to date was actually the one that was not even cybersecurity related. It was just career growth and the background of SoCanU and everything that went into building that company and the knowledge that we have as a result of like our leadership building that type of company in the past.
Yeah, that podcast did really well for us. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that we had that as a video podcast. And as we move forward into 2022, I'd really like to see us do more video podcasts. And I'm sure we'll end up doing that. But as we move forward, I think that we'll focus less on Prelude itself and we'll focus more on cybersecurity in general.
Yeah. In that vein, in this podcast, I think we're gonna do a little bit of the past and a little bit of the future here. So on the docket today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the big hacks of 2021. No real hard, fast details on what we're going to cover in that area, but we'll just kind of go with the flow. And then we're going to look forwards, and Kris and I have come up with some predictions for what we think is going to go down in 2022. Some serious, some less so. And then also we're going to select an area and an idea, each of us, that we think we would like to see more of in 2022 out of the cybersecurity industry or InfoSec industry at large. So yeah, that's a soft intro to what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I thought, it would be cool to talk about the hacks of 2021 and the big, what I think is like the big four that happened last year. And just to kind of like, I think that there's some predictability there. And so I thought it would be cool to talk about some of the things that happened last year, and maybe that ties into what our predictions are for next year or for this year, yeah. I should say. The first one that came to mind was the Colonial Pipeline, and the Colonial Pipeline stuff. What's interesting about it for me is that not only was it a ransomware attack that was obviously went against our U.S. East Coast infrastructure, but also the human aspect of it, where people just kind of freaked out and didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And even though that you may not have been affected by the Colonial Pipeline attack, or areas that weren't affected by it, you still had this panic
Yeah.
You know, my father's into oil and natural gas, and he noticed the uptick, even though in his area it wasn't a factor, right? Even though it was on the East Coast, still people were freaking out about being able to get oil into their cars, even though they weren't even going to the same pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, I live in that area, and I can say everywhere was sold out. I mean, there were lines. And what really interests me is not even the cybersecurity side of this, because I mean, that is interesting. No, don't get me wrong, but I think that's kind of been hammered to death in terms of technical detail. Something that interests me a lot about it is the implications of like how the media handled it, and how that almost, in my opinion, seemingly plays into a larger like influence operation, information operation campaign. And what could happen if a threat actor used like just even pushing fake news about a massive pipeline attack, the types of national level impacts that they could have as a result of that. And just thinking through that whole problem set, it's kind of scary to me that, hey, they didn't actually get access to the industrial control system itself. It was administrative networks, which is a big deal. I'm not trying to minimize that, but the larger implication is people heard pipeline hack, no oil, and news cycle picks that up, and we essentially did it to ourselves.
Yeah, we did
created this.
What was it? The like back in the, what was it, the 30s or 40s, the War of the Worlds radio.
Yeah,
sort of
goes
down
parallel.
the same path, where people just freaked out and didn't know what to do, and were fearful that they couldn't get to their jobs because they didn't have gas in their cars.
Yeah. There's that, I forget what it is or what the background on it is, but you have that general rule where the whole world is basically 3 days of food away from chaos.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that same concept here, where as soon as people realized, I might not be able to have gas for my car, it's the snake that eats its own tail. We just go out and it starts a snowball effect.
Yeah.
And putting myself into the shoes of a threat actor like Russia or China, Iran, I see the outputs of that type of campaign, right? And I see what impacts. I didn't have to do anything. I now, as a government that targets the U.S., know the impact that I can have by not even actually taking down a pipeline. Like, I just have to get onto a tangential network and get American news cycle to pick up pipeline and hack.
Yep.
And it does itself. Like, it takes care of the rest, take care of itself.
Yeah, in a lot of ways we hurt ourselves in that. People complaining about how much the cost of gas went up during that time. That was all because of people just being fearful that they couldn't get gas. It wasn't that there was a stoppage at the line and that the oil wasn't going through the pipeline. It was just that people just freaked out and they bought as much as they could. And then people then you had this whole other section, and I don't remember this or not, but the whole thing with the US government trying to tell people, like, don't go and fill up like trash bags with oil because that won't work.
Yeah.
And doing public service announcements to tell people to, like, the right way to fill up a like extra tank.
Yeah. I think this kind of creates a very interesting question that we as a nation don't really have an answer to. We as the US, I say nation. How can we accurately convey to people the impacts that some of these attacks can have, and when they legitimately should be concerned and when they shouldn't be? And how do we even begin to communicate with people effectively when we as an InfoSec community can barely communicate effectively internally?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of growing pains, and we'll get to this when we do our 2022 predictions moving forwards. I think we're going to see more of this kind of stuff, and it's going to be really interesting to see how national organizations like CISA approach handling the media and comms around these types of incidents. Because I think what it ultimately boils down to in terms of protecting society is a lot of managing communications and making sure people have accurate and clear information, along with accurate and clear levels of, hey, you should be X amount of worried, right?
Right.
Hey, don't go out and panic buy gas. I mean, some people just won't trust the government, but largely like, hey, you don't need to panic and freak out and go buy gas because the gas is still there. The company is doing a good job at recovering from this attack. You'll be fine. Like, how can we get that type of message out to people? And then how can we make sure that that message is actually accurate, right? Those are two interesting questions in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from a technical level, from the Colonial Pipeline stuff, one things that really stood out, and this has been the problem with cybersecurity and honestly data science in general, is that the data was there from the beginning, but the parsing of that data and being able to get to that data quickly and effectively was not there. And so I think one of the things that if you're out there, you're looking for things to do, figure out a way to better aggregate data, especially for a large amount of data. I remember when this first happened, I was working at P&L, and that was like the first thing that like came up was the fact that they had the data, they just didn't know, like they didn't know what to look for, and they had too much of it. Just like anything, we try to collect as much data as possible, but you can collect all the data you want, but you have to be able to parse it. And if you're looking at, like I said, things to do, if you can come out with a really great way to parse a whole bunch of data, that would help a lot. But I think that from a technical level, that was such a big part of that attack from the aftermath, was just being able to collect all the data.
But that attack in particular is, in my mind, very different in terms of like how it impacted society compared to the other three that we have on our list. True. The other three that we have are the SolarWinds hack, the NSO group tools, and that whole debacle, and Log4j. And I think of all of those, the Colonial Pipeline was the one that was the most real to people, and it created the most like physically visceral reaction in society.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of like actual impact to number of systems, it was probably nowhere close.
Right. And also too, this was like the perfect attack for something to happen and for people to understand the importance of our infrastructure without being so critically bad that it like would affect, say, the entire United States. This only affected the East Coast. But this was probably the perfect attack to get people to listen and to try to make changes, whether they do or not. But this was the perfect one that, like, if you could, like, maybe things could be a little bit better, but it was just enough, right, to get people to look and say, hey, this is something that we really need to have as an importance.
Yeah. And now we're seeing a lot of focus on supply chain, which is good, and also a pretty good segue into SolarWinds and Log4j, right? Because they're both supply chains in their own ways. One is attacking way up the chain. The other is more of a dependency that is used everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think the focus on dependencies and the focus on supply chain is good. So yeah, like how much reading, how much background do you have on SolarWinds in particular?
So I don't really have too much on the SolarWinds stuff, except for I find that the SolarWinds stuff was entirely predictable. If you went into any government site and you looked around at their TVs, they had SolarWinds.
Yeah.
and so like if you wanted to make an impact on US government infrastructure, go affect SolarWinds. And I think that was entirely predictable. And it also sort of shows that our infrastructure is reliant on tools that are not made necessarily by the US government itself. And so they have to rely on companies to make these tools, which is totally what we need to do, because if we tried to have the US government create tools for themselves, they would be like half baked and not that great. Yeah, like SolarWinds, I think was totally predictable in that part, and we rely on these tools. We have to have tools that we can purchase that do great things that allow you to do, aggregation of data and infrastructure type stuff. It's relied too heavily on as well. It's the Superman complex of infrastructure data aggregation.
Yeah.
And so
I like your way of kind of focusing on impact, though, because ultimately that makes sense, right? When you're planning offensive operations and you're doing your targeting and going through your targeting cycle, like, you have your objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? And you're going to go for the targets that directly help you accomplish your objective. And that goes back to some of the things that we've talked about in the past, which is understanding your critical assets and understanding, doing that crown jewels analysis and knowing what your centers of gravity are for your business.
Yeah.
So I like that way of approaching these hacks of 2021 as a framework for talking about them. Because SolarWinds, I mean, from my time in the government, every place that I went used SolarWinds.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes complete sense. So as a threat, if knowing that a lot of the, like, you can go out and get unclassified FOUO software documents that define things that are part of weapon systems and part of like the infrastructure for a base, right? So if I can get access to an unclassified network, that FOUO information is going to be there, and then I can basically like cross-reference off all of that data. What is the software that is most commonly used, and use that as my targeting strategy. So SolarWinds would make sense in that vein. And I think, given where now we can kind of transition on to Log4j, given who reported Log4j, like that would be another one of those targeting everything type scenarios.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just the whole thing with the Chinese government being upset that Alibaba disclosed Log4j was in a lot of ways telling.
Yeah.
And that's that's something that too, like from a government perspective, like the art of disclosure, like in a lot of ways for a company, if you disclose a security vulnerability, like you disclose a 0-day that you discovered and it's now a CVE, you disclose that and you create a POC for that, like that's recognition of your security team and the great work that they're doing. But at the same time, what does that burn in some ways? Clearly the US the Chinese government was probably using log or some type of vulnerability for Log4j and got upset because it burned an asset.
Burned an asset that probably gave them access to a lot of things.
Yep.
But this is a good transition into our last hack. So we've talked a little bit about SolarWinds and Log4j. I think why NSO was a good selection for your list that you came up here, because in my mind, on the commercial side, we only ever really see what the known unknowns are, right? And very rarely do we get to glimpse those unknown unknowns. And seeing the Google Project Zero write-up of the NSO no-click iMessage exploit and like how absurdly convoluted that is.
Yeah.
It's super fascinating. If you're listening and you have not read about the NSO exploit, Google Project Zero did a fantastic write-up on it. But to summarize it really briefly, they basically could send a GIF to an iMessage, and then they abused the iMessage GIF parsing, like stream parser, and were able to literally use a function to emulate the basics of a computer, like of a CPU, via a GIF and like XORing various fields in the GIF decompression algorithm. Like, it's the most ludicrous thing. And that's one of those glimpses into the art of the possible, right? That we rarely get to see on the commercial side. And that when you're in that spooky behind closed doors and you can lock the skiff and talk about capabilities, like, that's the type of stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
And we just don't know about it. And we can't know about it, right? The unknown unknowns.
Right.
And I think, we're not to jump too far ahead, we're going to see more of that kind of stuff as it gets leaked. You have online aggregators like VX Underground. They do a fantastic job of people just dump all the malware samples that they find and the exploits that they find, and they aggregate it for us, and it's great.
Yeah, and too, like the whole thing about like the spooky attacks is this will become more prevalent, and it will probably affect more people as time goes on. But I think too, once it's known, it will be so quick to fix in a lot of ways. That we'll end up with just more stuff, right? Like, yeah. We know, like Zero Dumb, for instance, just collects these things and we'll sell them. So it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. But that's also why we focus on detection and not necessarily trying to find these obtuse, esoteric ways
that get burned so quickly.
Get access to a phone. But in that same vein, like, we don't have really robust detection mechanisms for phones.
Yeah.
We don't really have a lot of the endpoint methodologies and professionalism that exists in modern enterprises on mobile devices.
And there's not that nation state level of, I mean, it probably just goes back to the detection, but the nation state level of that and understanding what may come as a result. So, like, I think sometimes enterprise can get blinded where they are clearly know the reactionary things that are happening, but aren't necessarily looking at, okay, well, if someone has a 0 day for an iOS device, what does that mean for my company? Maybe some of them.
You actually
do, but
reminded
not very
me.
Many.
You just reminded me of an interesting talk that I saw at CactusCon back in gonna show age here, 2015 or 2016. The researchers at ASU were basically scraping and aggregating data off like malware resale sites on the dark web. And what they were doing is creating personas, but also generalized data surrounding the types of things people wanted exploits for. And the whole idea was that if they could get ahead of what people were trying to purchase exploits for in terms of software and operating system and hardware and so on, you can then start building predictive models of where exploits are going to start coming in the future and incorporate that into your defense in depth strategy. So now you have like a predictive model of how they're going to get access, or what the up and coming most recent access methodologies might be in terms of exploits or privilege escalation or whatever. And then you can layer that into your existing detection methodologies. That gives you that extra power up on your ability to detect things that that you probably wouldn't have even known would be coming to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of too like doing like analysis of phones, like their callback data to like from like say ads to understand what phones are prevalent in a certain area. Then you could understand like, oh well, likelihood that you would find vulnerabilities with these particular devices because of that. Interesting stuff.
Yeah. And that's only a small sampling of what came out of the NSO group tools, right? You can go, I think a full Pegasus implant is available on VX Underground if you want to like go reverse it or whatever.
Yeah, I think that out of everything from especially the NSO group tool type stuff, like there's been tools that have been released over time from big groups that either are nation state or not, or very close to nation state level tools. And I think if you're out there, you don't really understand or know the capabilities that exist at the nation state level, take a good look at NSO. And then you can kind of take your wild guesses of what else could be out there based on the level of sophistication.
Yeah. The good way to think about it is, remember, NSO is just a private company.
Yep.
And they can do that. Now think of what a nation state can do. NSO does have budget restrictions and time restrictions, being a private company. Remove that.
And NSO was Israeli, so they were probably coming from their nation state capabilities department. But yeah, they still have restrictions, unlike some nation states that have just blank checks.
This is true. Now, I think it's a pretty good segue into what we think is going to happen in 2022.
Yeah.
So we're taking a leaf out of one of the podcasts that I love and I listen to all the time. It's called Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And one thing they do every single year is it's kind of a making fun of psychics and people who are just, charlatans and frauds. So they like to, at the beginning of every year, make predictions of what they think is going to happen in the year, and then they come back in the following January and assess whether or not they were accurate. And they give varying levels of accuracy or how deep they want to go on this. Some of them are just kind of like wishy-washy, of course it's going to happen, but some of them are like very, very specific. So I thought that was pretty fun, and I figured we'd try to give that a go ourselves and see if we could come up with things we think will happen in 2022. Then we can come back to in 2023 and see if we're close, completely missed the mark, or what.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be a lot of fun.
All right, Chris, why don't you go ahead and go first?
All right. So the first thing I had as a prediction. So I'm a huge buff for world event type stuff and like understanding the geopolitical stuff that goes around every day. I think this year we will see the Russia-Ukraine conflict go into full effect this year. I think it was likely postponed because of the Kazakhstan unrest that's going on right now. I think the U.S. will end up getting more involved because of Kazakhstan. So I think from a perspective of the Ukraine, having the unrest happen in Kazakhstan was probably the best thing that could happen for them because it shined more light into the Russia's push towards their influence in other regions. And I think that there was questions asked about what was going on in Kazakhstan from the U.S., but I do think that we'll see this conflict happen. I remember when we first saw the stuff in Crimea, and I followed that to a T. Even did some cool work when I was in the university to help out the Ukrainian government through NATO, which was interesting work. And so, I think that will happen this year. How big it will be in effect, maybe it will end up being a lot like the Crimea, where it will just be small groups But we could see a bigger conflict happen as well. I think even for Ukraine, I think that there's that bubble there where I think Ukraine is battle hardened and a little tired of Russia. And you can see it in some of the generals from Ukraine and what they're talking about. It sounds like they're just kind of tired of it, and this might be obviously conflict is terrible, and you don't want that to happen. But it's probably the time that this will end up kicking off this year.
Okay. So prediction number 1, you think the Russia-Ukraine is going to pop off this year?
Yep. I think we'll see some awesome cyber stuff from that.
Yeah. Well, what is it called? Petya Not Petya Part 3.
Yeah.
Sorry to laugh. I'm not laughing at that. That's not good. That's very bad.
Yeah. I think people in the security space know this, but Ukraine has some of the best in cyber people. And a lot of them ended up going to Russia when Ukraine happened. And so I think we'll see some interesting stuff, whether that will be from the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. But as we talked about predictive models and being able to have aggregators in place, that will be a good indication of some of the sophistication from both Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah. Tipping and queuing, wonder what it'll be.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see some of the attacks that come through that. Even without the aggression or conflict that would happen, there's still going to be cyber stuff that will go and play.
All right. Do you have another prediction?
Yeah, my other prediction is that I think we'll see our first large major hack on 5G telecom this year. I don't think that... I think that and I'll say US 5G telecom. I think that the telecom industry, specifically the big 4 or big 3 now, telecom providers, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile. I think that they're aware that something could happen, and I think that they are making some steps very slowly. But I don't think that they quite understand the level of sophistication and what people or what the actual attack vectors are. I think that there's still a lot of there's a lot of that industry that still thinks that it's really comes down to the mobile devices and not necessarily the infrastructure and what is the key targets in the infrastructure. And so I think this year we'll end up seeing something. I think it will be for the better good, just because without this happening, we're less reliant on 5G than we will be in the next few years. If this is going to happen last year, this year is the key times to do it. As we move forward and with more reliance on 5G and 6G, this will become a much bigger target.
Yeah. That unfortunately tracks.
Yeah.
But yeah. Hope is not a course of action, but we can hope.
So Alex, what do you got?
Yeah, so I have 3. I have 2 serious ones and then one that, man, it would be just so cool. But 100% won't happen. But I'm still going to make it anyways, because in the off chance I'm right, I get to be that guy that predicted it. Anyways, so I think, number 1, in a similar vein to you talking about 5G, I think this year we're going to see a major attack on the U.S. electric grid that's going to end up knocking out power for a significant period of time. And not sure, I'm not going to talk east-west Texas grid, but it'll be one of them, and I think we'll see significant legislative reform coming out of that. And that's actually my second one. I think we will see the U.S. legislators passing some form of hackback bill that will authorize companies to basically respond in kind to threats and threat actors that are aggressing against them. And that would give us a way, like as a nation, to start hitting back, so to speak, which would be awesome. And then my number 3 is just a throwaway, but again, it'd be so cool. I think the first images that we get from the James Webb Space Telescope are going to show us ancient alien civilizations from the dawn of the early years of the universe.
We're going full X-Files.
Yes, 100%. Just show me some Dyson spheres, like something. Dyson swarms, I don't care.
So
alien spaceships, whatever, man.
So are you calling out a specific infrastructure within Texas for your electric grid, or are you just gonna go full beans?
I think I don't know nearly enough to say which is more locked down than any other.
Yeah.
I am nowhere qualified to say that. So I just think there will be something.
Yeah.
And I think the impact will be significant to a significant number of people for a period of time. These are predictions. I can be kind of wishy-washy. I don't have to be accurate.
Yeah, I'm all for the hackback stuff. I'm hoping. I mean, sadly, I think what will end up happening, and I think we touched on this before the podcast, was that this will likely happen as a result of something big, and then it will just get rushed to the floor. And sadly, that's probably the reactionary measures that end up happening. We've been talking about this for a really long time within the U.S. government, and this should have happened years ago. And the fact that it hasn't is kind of unfortunate, but it will be even more unfortunate the way it will end up getting passed, which is just because of some reactionary measure to some large attack.
Yeah, there was a recent article in, I think, Wired or New Yorker, something, talking about, I think it was a Sandia National Labs researcher that got fed up and essentially started just like set up his own honeypot that Chinese threat actors eventually got into and exfilled information to, and he got remote access, and then his access and everything that he had turned into like 6 or 7 different FBI investigations that like his one hackback turned into a huge thing for the U.S. government.
Yeah.
And I think turning on that faucet and letting, like, even if it's just like turning it on a little bit to allow the drip. I mean, I think as soon as we have 1 or 2 more of those success stories, like somebody's cyber defense team gets access to a Russian crime syndicate and then crypto locks them. Like,
yeah.
How great would that be?
Yeah. And to your point, I think, we talked about this earlier as well, was that this will probably just end up being for enterprise, not necessarily for every individual within the United States to be able to do hackback. But granted, other countries, let them go full beans. So we are at a disadvantage there. And it's not necessarily it's not, us being affected by necessarily the smaller individuals from, say, a Russian organization or China trying to do like nation state level hacking. It's more of it affects the small people and small businesses that it ends up affecting. And so that's some of the problems that we have as a result of not being able to do hackback.
Yeah.
So
those are our predictions for 2022. Now let's kind of ground it a little bit in things that we would like to see that probably should happen, that we're not just going to speculate on.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll go first. One of the things that I want to see in 2022 out of companies is more utilization of paved road security approaches, a la what Netflix does. So if you're not familiar, Netflix came up with a concept internally they call paved road security, where essentially they have a team that manages their authentication. They have a team that manages their web application firewalls. And then when they want to bring services online, a new service development team can basically just subscribe to their security, just import their libraries, and they're off to the running. And 15 minutes later, they can have a application in production. And they've offloaded a lot of the intricacies of security to teams that can specialize on it. And the more, in my opinion, the more that companies can adopt those types of strategies and get away from internal software using their own ways to authenticate, their own ways to hook into all the other services that exist in their organization, the better off those organizations will be.
Yeah.
And this is one that we talk about internally at Prelude, as like, how can we start adopting these types of methodologies? We don't have a whole lot of software yet that we need to get online, but the more that we can bake this into our design methodologies up front, the more that we can be not only advocates of an idea we think makes sense, but also the way that we openly talk about our software and the way that we openly share our software, we can start getting some of these approaches out to people so they can adopt them and use them in their own organizations.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on our last podcast as well. It's definitely something that needs to be implemented in a lot more companies. And I think something that might help with that is like a template, sort of a template style, which Netflix has sort of provided people to be able to do. So for my hope or of a security technology that I'd like to see in 2022 or concept to be adopted is a change in ICS and SCADA manufacturers to adopt more secure software development for ICS and SCADA devices. I think companies like Schneider Electric, Siemens, they have a lot that they have to do, but they tend to not focus necessarily too much on the software side and the firmware side. They're more focused on what makes sense for their customer and what it can do, and less on the security aspect. I do think that maybe this ends up being a prediction, but I do think that the U.S. government will be more forceful with these companies to adopt secure software. But I really hope that these companies end up doing a lot of the adoption themselves. We get away from writing, say, firmware in C and start writing firmware in Rust. I think that would be a huge step forward for ICS and SCADA. And if the companies don't do it themselves, they'll be forced to do it if they want to continue to operate. So I think that this year really needs to be the year for these companies to really break out and be like almost like Apple, and how they really try to promote privacy for better or for worse.
Until they want to scan your images on your
phone. I think that these companies like Schneider and Siemens and ABB, they really have to dig hard into the security and the software security side, and this is the year to do it.
Yeah, that would be a good thing for the ICS SCADA world.
ICS and SCADA will become more of a reliance every single year for us. For the entire world, and we need the security backbone and the security of these things to be pretty spot on. So that's going to do it for our podcast today. We're on all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcast. If you use a particular podcasting platform that we're not a part of, please let us know in our Discord and we can add 0verture to it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing to us. We are planning to do 2 podcasts a month, and we release on Fridays. So thanks for listening. We'll be back on January 28th. Prelude out.